Ethan Ward had always lived a quiet life on the land his father left him. It wasn't fancy or modern, but it was peaceful. The property stretched far beyond what most people could easily walk in a day, and at the far end of it sat the old reservoir his father had built decades ago. The water was still, calm, and beautiful in the early mornings, especially when sunlight touched the surface and made it glow like a sheet of glass. Ethan loved that view more than any city skyline or any expensive attraction other people talked about. Most days were simple for him. He woke up before sunrise, made a cup of tea, and walked the fence lines or checked on the dam. He didn't need a crowd. He didn't need attention. The land gave him everything he wanted: work, peace, and space to think. His father had taught him early that land was more than soil and trees. It was responsibility. And Ethan carried that responsibility with quiet pride. Everything changed the morning he saw the first group of surveyors walking on the far side of his property. At first, he thought they might be part of some county maintenance team, maybe checking drainage lines. But as he walked closer, he noticed their bright vests and measuring equipment. They weren't just examining land, they were marking it. One of the men looked up and smiled politely, the way people smile when they want to seem respectful, but don't actually want to talk. Ethan asked them what they were doing. The man told him they were preparing for a new housing development for the Riverside Meadows, HOA. They were confirming boundaries before construction started. Ethan felt confused more than angry. Boundaries? Housing development? What boundaries were they talking about? The land they stood on was his. Every inch of it had been passed down legally, carefully, and documented. He asked the surveyor whether they had permission or papers to be there. The man waved off the question, saying their office had everything they needed and that the public land nearby had been approved for development months ago. Public land. Ethan almost laughed. There was no public land out here. This entire stretch belonged to his father before him and his grandfather before that. Maybe the surveyors had taken a wrong turn or misunderstood something. He told them plainly that the land wasn't public. But they seemed convinced of their own information and continued their work. Ethan didn't shout or argue. His father had always taught him not to waste breath on people who believed papers more than truth. So he walked back home, but the uneasy feeling stayed with him the rest of the day. Something wasn't right. A week passed before the situation grew worse. It started with the rumbling sound of heavy machinery engines, drills, trucks, echoing across the fields. Ethan hurried toward the noise and felt his heart sink when he saw construction vehicles tearing into the soil. Workers were unloading lumber and steel beams. Markers were placed in rows, outlining what looked like the foundations of houses. Dozens of them. Ethan approached the project manager, a middle-aged man with a clipboard who looked busy and slightly annoyed by any interruption. Ethan asked what on earth they thought they were doing. The manager responded calmly, almost casually, that the HOA had already purchased this land through the county. He even added that Ethan probably wasn't aware of the sale because it happened during a tax auction years back. Ethan felt a spike of disbelief. There had never been a tax auction for his land. He had paid his taxes on time every year. His father had done the same before him. He explained this, but the manager barely listened. He repeated the same line. The land was purchased legally, as if it was a memorized script. He had workers waiting, schedules to follow, deadlines to meet, and he clearly didn't want to be slowed down. Ethan walked away without raising his voice. Getting angry wouldn't fix anything. If anything, it would push them to ignore him faster. He needed facts, not arguments. So that evening, he sat at his old wooden table and spread out every document he owned, every deed, survey, tax receipt, and water rights paper. Everything lined up exactly the way he remembered. The land was unquestionably his. The next morning, he drove to the county registrar's office. The building was quiet, the kind of place where time seemed slower than everywhere else. He explained the problem to the clerk, who looked puzzled and started digging through old files. After almost an hour of searching, the clerk found something odd: a map that had been updated a few years back. Some properties were marked differently from where they actually were. The clerk admitted that the county had switched mapping software, and some boundaries got shifted by mistake. Ethan's land had been one of them. It wasn't sold. It wasn't part of any official listing. It was simply mislabeled in a digital system. No one bothered to double-check. Ethan asked the clerk whether the HOA had verified anything before starting construction. The clerk shrugged helplessly. They didn't know. They only saw that a permit had been issued, which meant someone approved it. Whether the approval was mistaken or based on an inaccurate map, no one could say for sure. When Ethan returned home, the construction site had grown. More trucks, more workers, more noise. Wooden frames were rising quickly. What used to be open fields were turning into rows of half-built homes. Some neighbors started driving by, slowing their cars and staring curiously. A few even spoke to Ethan, accusing him of being selfish because the new houses would improve the area and bring in new families. They acted like he was stopping a community dream rather than protecting his own property. Ethan didn't argue with them either. He simply repeated the truth. The land was his. Most didn't believe him. Some said he was being dramatic. One person even suggested he should be grateful. The HOA was improving the land for him. Ethan realized something important. People trusted paperwork more than the person who actually lived on the land. So he stopped trying to convince anyone out loud. Instead, he focused on gathering evidence. Every time a worker stepped onto his property, he noted the date and time. Every piece of soil moved, every plank lifted, every advertisement listing the new homes for sale. He documented it all. Quietly, privately, and carefully. While the HOA hurried to finish their housing project, Ethan walked to the dam one evening and sat on the concrete edge. The reservoir's water rippled gently beneath him. It had always been part of his life. The dam wasn't big or dangerous. It was designed to hold and release water smoothly whenever rainfall increased. His father used to remind him that the dam was safe as long as it wasn't messed with, and that the spillway had a very predictable path. From where Ethan sat, he could see the edges of the new houses in the distance. They were far too close to the natural spillway. He doubted the developers even knew what a spillway was. They had probably looked at the reservoir on a map and thought it was a simple pond. Ethan knew better. The dam wasn't a threat, but it had rules. Nature had rules too. Water followed its path, whether people built homes there or not. He thought about talking to the HOA board, trying once more to explain, but he already knew how that would go. They weren't interested in listening. They were interested in completing their project. They were interested in profit. They were interested in speed. And he was interested in the truth. After sunset, when the workers finally packed up for the day and the engines went quiet, Ethan walked the edge of the reservoir again. He noticed a few construction vehicles parked strangely close to the spillway area. It made him uneasy, not because it endangered him, but because they had no idea where they were standing. His father's voice echoed in his mind. Calm, gentle, and steady. Don't raise your voice unless you have to. Let people walk their own path. The truth doesn't need noise. Ethan had lived by those words all his life. And now, more than ever, he felt their weight. He didn't need to fight the HOA with anger. He didn't need to go to the construction site and argue with every supervisor who ignored him. The truth would reveal itself in time. The land had its own way of speaking. By the time the foundations of all 35 houses were complete, people started treating Ethan like an obstacle instead of a landowner. But he remained patient, calm even. He knew something they didn't. Paperwork mistakes could be corrected. But rushing into a situation without understanding it always came with consequences. Every evening, as the houses grew taller, as roofs were added, as driveways were poured, Ethan watched silently from a distance. Not with anger or spite, but with a strange mix of sadness and certainty. This land had been his family's for generations. It carried stories, memories, and lessons. And now, strangers were building over it as if none of that mattered. Ethan didn't plan revenge. He didn't wish harm to anyone. All he wanted was what belonged to him. And he knew the day would come when he'd have to show everyone the truth. The truth was already in his hands, in the form of the original deed, the water rights documents, the surveys, and the county's admission of error. All he had to do now was wait, and Ethan Ward had always been good at waiting. Ethan returned from the county office with a folder full of documents, but the way he felt was not from the papers. It was the realization that the HOA had moved ahead without checking a single thing. They trusted a digital map more than the man who lived on the land. And now 35 houses were rising, where they shouldn't have been built at all. He placed the folder on his kitchen table that evening and sat quietly for a long time. Outside, the construction noise had finally stopped for the day. The silence felt heavier than usual. He poured himself a cup of tea and looked over the papers again, the deed with his father's signature, the old survey maps, the water rights certificate, and the letter the clerk had given him admitting that the county made a mapping mistake. Everything was in his favor. Yet the HOA acted like none of it existed. The next morning, Ethan decided to try once more to talk to the people responsible. He wasn't someone who enjoyed confrontation, but he believed in giving people a fair chance to understand the truth. So he walked to the construction site and asked to speak to whoever was in charge that day. The workers looked busy and stressed, as if delays meant trouble for them, not for the people building the homes. One of them pointed toward a temporary trailer where the HOA representatives worked. Inside, he found a woman with short, neat hair and a sharp expression. She introduced herself as the acting board president of Riverside Meadows HOA. Her tone was polite but brisk, like someone who was already late for 3 meetings. Ethan explained the entire situation slowly and clearly. He showed her the deed, the surveys, and even the county's letter. She didn't bother hiding her frustration. She skimmed the documents, but didn't seem to absorb anything. Instead, she insisted that their lawyers had reviewed the land purchase, and that construction was already too far along to stop. She kept repeating that the HOA had permission from the county, and if the county made a mistake, then the county should fix it, not them. Ethan had expected resistance, but not this level of stubbornness. He tried to stay calm and asked her a simple question. Did anyone from your side actually check the ownership before building? She didn't answer. Instead, she shifted the blame again, saying the responsibility belonged to the county and that the HOA had acted in good faith. Ethan realized there was no point arguing. She wasn't interested in the truth, only in finishing the project. When he stepped outside, the workers were unloading more materials. Some houses already had roofs. Others were being fitted with windows. Families were touring the area, smiling as salespeople explained how affordable the new homes were. Some visitors gave Ethan curious looks, probably wondering why a man in plain clothes was wandering the construction site without a hard hat. One couple even asked him if he lived nearby. Ethan nodded politely, though he didn't feel like explaining the whole story to strangers. They said they were excited about the community. The HOA was promising clean streets, shared parks, and a quiet neighborhood perfect for families. They spoke with such hope in their voices that Ethan's heart sank a little. He didn't wish trouble on innocent families. They had no idea the land they wanted to buy wasn't legally for sale. He returned home with a strange mix of sadness and determination. He didn't want to ruin anyone's dreams, but he couldn't allow his family's land to be taken. Not like this. Not because someone trusted a wrong map and assumed no one would question it. That night, he walked along the reservoir, trying to clear his mind. The water looked calm, but he knew it could rise rapidly when the rainy season came. The dam's overflow system was built to handle sudden increases. It wasn't dangerous, but it followed a strict path that nature determined long before anyone dreamed of building homes nearby. As he walked, he noticed the stakes and construction flags from the housing project were getting closer to the spillway. That alone made him uneasy. The HOA didn't seem to understand the land they were building on. They had no idea of the natural water routes, the soil patterns, or the seasonal changes. They only saw open space and profit. The next week brought even more problems. Ethan began receiving letters from the HOA accusing him of interfering with development. They claimed he was blocking progress and causing complications. One letter even demanded he remove unauthorized fencing that had been on his property for over 30 years. They were trying to flip the narrative, turning him into the troublemaker, but Ethan stayed calm. Instead of reacting emotionally, he stored each letter carefully. He marked the dates, added them to his evidence folder, and kept everything organized. He knew this would matter later. A few days later, a county inspector arrived at his doorstep. The inspector seemed tired and overworked, the kind of person juggling too many assignments at once. He told Ethan there had been complaints about the reservoir and the dam. According to the HOA, the water was too close to the new homes and posed a risk. Ethan kept his temper in check. He explained that the reservoir had been there long before the homes and that the dam was approved by the state decades ago. The inspector asked to see the paperwork, which Ethan gladly provided. After looking through the documents, the inspector's expression softened. He realized Ethan had everything in order. Still, he explained that the HOA was pushing for the reservoir to be drained for community safety. Ethan shook his head. I can't drain it. And even if I wanted to, the dam isn't designed for that. It follows a natural cycle. The inspector sighed and admitted he understood. He promised to file a report, clarifying that Ethan was within his rights and that the dam posed no immediate issue. But Ethan knew the HOA wouldn't stop there. They were determined to make him look like the problem. Over the next 2 weeks, tension grew quietly in the background. Construction kept moving. The houses now looked nearly complete. Some had their final touches added, gardens planted, driveways smoothed, mailboxes installed. It was incredible how fast everything changed. But while the HOA rushed forward, the sky also began to change. Darker clouds rolled in earlier than usual. Rainfall started heavier than expected. The weather forecast predicted more storms in the coming weeks. Ethan watched his reservoir rise. Slowly, yes. Safely, yes. But steadily. He inspected the dam daily, checking the gauges and making sure everything functioned the way it always had. The dam wasn't meant to break. It wasn't built to cause damage. It simply released excess water through the spillway when the level reached a certain point. A system designed by his father and approved by engineers long ago. Still, the situation worried him, not because of the dam, but because of the houses. They sat right in the natural path where water would flow during heavy rains. Not flooding, not destruction, just the regular overflow path the land had followed for decades. But that small truth was something the HOA had never taken time to learn. One evening, when the rain had paused for a moment, Ethan took a walk down the boundary lines. He carried a set of bright markers and stakes. Not to warn the HOA, they ignored every warning he ever gave. No, He placed the markers so that he had proof later. Proof that he had identified the spillway path. Proof that he knew his land. Proof that he wasn't hiding anything. He took pictures of each marker, took notes on their locations, and saved everything in his phone and notebook. Ethan wasn't preparing for conflict. He was preparing for clarity. He wanted the truth to be visible to anyone who asked for a dot as he finished placing the last marker. He looked at the houses standing nearby, bright, new, freshly painted, and sitting on land that did not belong to the HOA. He felt no anger, only a quiet certainty. The rain began again, gentle at first, then heavier. The reservoir would fill. The dam would do what it was built to do. And eventually, the truth about the land would come out. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but the truth had its own timeline, and Ethan had patience, more patience than the HOA could ever imagine. The rain didn't stop for days. It fell in steady sheets, the kind that made everything look washed out and quiet. The fields darkened, the soil grew softer, and the air carried that damp smell that usually reminded Ethan of early spring. But this time, the rain felt heavier somehow, as if the land itself was preparing for something. Every morning, Ethan put on his old boots and walked the trail to the reservoir. The water line was rising slowly, inch by inch. He checked the dam, the gauges, and the spillway. Everything worked exactly the way it was designed to work. Nothing unusual, nothing dangerous. Just nature doing what nature always did. But the HOA didn't see it that way. They had sent 2 more letters during the week. One said his reservoir was a public hazard. Another claimed that his dam was outdated and needed immediate adjustment because they're new. Homes were at risk. The language felt more threatening each time. They weren't asking anymore. They were demanding. Ethan kept each letter in his folder. One morning, as he finished checking the dam, he noticed 2 HOA members standing on the far edge of his land, umbrellas in hand, staring at the reservoir with worried expressions. He walked up to them calmly, though he already sensed what they were here to complain about. One of them pointed at the water and said it was too close to the houses. Ethan explained the same thing he had explained a dozen times. This was normal. The reservoir expanded during heavy rain and then returned to its usual level once the weather cleared. It had been this way for decades, but they didn't seem to hear him. Or maybe they didn't want to. They said the board was already discussing legal action if he didn't solve the issue. Ethan asked how he was supposed to solve rainfall. The question didn't get a response. They walked away looking frustrated, and Ethan could tell they blamed him, not the weather, not the land, not the mistake their own board had made. Just him. Later that afternoon, he saw an HOA truck pull up near the boundary line. A few people stepped out and started taking photos of the reservoir. One of them pointed at the dam like it was some kind of threat. They were collecting evidence against him, even though the truth was right in front of them. The irony wasn't lost on Ethan. They were building homes illegally on his land, yet they were gathering complaints against his reservoir that had always been there. The rain got heavier the next day. The wind picked up, and the sky grew darker. Ethan put on his jacket and walked out again to check everything. The reservoir was nearly at the top of the normal range. If the rain kept coming, it would eventually reach the overflow point. But that was normal. The dam wasn't designed to hold water endlessly. It was designed to release extra water slowly and safely through the spillway, a natural path the land had always followed. Still, Ethan couldn't ignore the tension in his chest. The houses were simply too close. Not dangerously close, but close enough that the spillway would definitely reach them. It wasn't his fault. He hadn't built the homes. He hadn't signed off on anything. He hadn't approved the permits or misread the maps. Yet he knew the HOA would blame him when the water reached the spillway path. They would accuse him again. They would claim he caused it on purpose. People rarely accepted responsibility when it was easier to point fingers. That evening, when the rain briefly softened, Ethan walked down to the spillway to check the markers he had placed earlier. Some were leaning slightly from the wet ground, so he pushed them back in firmly. He took updated pictures. He made notes. Evidence mattered. Even if people ignored him, he wanted the truth written clearly somewhere. On his way back, he saw the lights from the nearly finished homes glowing softly through the mist. It looked peaceful from a distance. He wondered if the families who planned to buy these houses had any idea what was happening behind the scenes. They probably imagined quiet mornings and friendly neighbors. Maybe they dreamed of barbecues, weekend walks, and living somewhere calm, far from city noise. None of them knew the land beneath their future homes wasn't theirs to buy. He felt a little sorry for them. They were innocent in all this. They trusted the HOA. They trusted the salespeople. They trusted the paperwork. And they were walking straight into a situation that would disappoint them deeply. The next day, the HOA president visited his property again. She came during another downpour, wearing a raincoat and holding a thick folder. She didn't bother with small talk. She walked right up to Ethan and said the reservoir had reached a danger point, and he needed to lower it immediately. Ethan tried to stay patient. "I can't lower it," he explained. "The dam isn't built for that. It releases water automatically once it reaches a certain level." She accused him of being irresponsible. She said he was putting families in danger. She insisted that he was required to take action because their homes were nearby. Forced responsibility, Ethan thought quietly. That's what she wanted. She wanted him to change nature to fit their mistake. He repeated calmly that the reservoir followed natural patterns. He reminded her that the dam was approved decades ago. She didn't care. She kept trying to pressure him. When she finally realized he wouldn't agree, she stormed off. Saying this wasn't over. Ethan watched her go, water dripping from her umbrella, her footsteps splashing angrily through puddles. He felt no anger toward her. Frustration, yes. But he also understood something she didn't. The land had its own logic. You couldn't force it to behave differently just because you built houses in the wrong spot. That night, the rain beat against his roof like steady drums. Every few hours, Ethan checked the gauges. The reservoir edged closer to the overflow point. The spillway would activate soon. The cycle couldn't be stopped, not by him, not by the HOA, not by anyone. He didn't sleep much. Not because he feared anything, but because he knew how the HOA would react the moment they saw water flowing. Even if the flow was controlled and expected, they would panic. They would blame him. They would pretend this was something new instead of something the land had always done. By dawn, the rain had eased slightly, but the sky still looked thick and heavy, as if more was coming. Ethan grabbed his jacket and walked down toward the dam. When he reached the edge of the reservoir, he saw the water had finally reached the overflow channel. It would release soon. He felt a strange mix of calm and concern. The system was working exactly as intended. Nothing dangerous, nothing unusual. But he knew what the HOA would think when they saw it. As he stood there, hands in his pockets, listening to the wind pushing against the water, he noticed a group of HOA members on the ridge near their homes. They were pointing at the reservoir, talking loudly among themselves, clearly alarmed. They didn't understand that the overflow was a normal part of the reservoir's design. A few minutes later, the HOA president arrived again. She looked frantic this time. She asked Ethan if he could shut the dam off. Ethan explained once more that it wasn't a switch. It wasn't something he controlled. It was automatic. It was engineered for safety. She didn't want to hear it. "We have homes down there." She shouted over the wind. Ethan stayed steady. "And I've told you for weeks," he said softly. "Those homes are on my land." She opened her mouth as if to argue, then closed it again. She didn't know what to say. Or maybe she didn't want to admit anything. The wind picked up, and the first thin streams of water trickled into the spillway. It wasn't traumatic. It wasn't sudden. It was gentle, steady, predictable, exactly how it is supposed to be. The HOA members backed away, nervous and uncertain. They didn't understand the system, but they knew water usually meant trouble. Ethan stood quietly, watching the land behave exactly as his father told him it would. Nature was honest. It didn't hide mistakes, and soon everyone else would see the truth too. The morning after the heavy trucks rolled in, the entire valley felt different. The air was cooler than usual, and a thin mist hung across the fields, drifting slowly toward the half-finished neighborhood the HOA had built. It gave the place an almost unreal look, as if everything that had happened in the last years was part of some long, strange dream. But for him, nothing felt like a dream. Everything was too sharp, too loud, too real. He had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the empty dam, the dry ground where the water had once stood, the men arguing about paperwork, and the HOA's smug faces when they still thought they had won. He kept replaying it all, not because he wanted to, but because his mind refused to rest. For years, he had held back, stayed quiet, and waited patiently while strangers treated his land as if it were their own. Now the day everyone had tried to avoid was getting closer, and there was no turning back. He stood on the small rise behind his house, looking toward the dam. It was strange seeing it like that, silent, drained, and waiting. The gates were closed now, but only he knew what would happen when the court confirmed the deed, when the papers became official, when the truth could no longer be ignored. The whole situation had become like a rope stretched too tight. All it needed was one pull, and everything would snap. He walked down the hill, slowly thinking through each step, each moment, each consequence. People often thought he had acted out of anger or pride, but anger had never driven him. What drove him was something different, something deeper. It was the simple belief that people should respect what doesn't belong to them. And if they don't, they should be ready to face whatever comes next. He never wanted trouble, never wanted a fight. All he wanted was fairness. But fairness was something the HOA had refused to give Dot by the time he reached his small workshop. The sun had started to break through the mist. The wooden walls glowed softly, and the faint smell of old tools and dry earth filled the air. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. Everything was exactly where he had left it, papers stacked neatly, maps pinned on the wall, old survey records arranged in a long row. Each one carried years of history, the kind the HOA never bothered to read. He sat down, leaned back in the chair, and closed his eyes for a moment. There was a strange peace in the room, the kind that comes before something big changes. He felt the weight of the coming days pressing on his shoulders. But he wasn't afraid, just tired. Tired from carrying the truth alone. Tired from defending something that was his from the first day he was born. A knock on the door broke his thoughts. He opened his eyes and looked up. A neighbor from the other side of the valley stood in the doorway. A quiet man, older, someone who preferred tending his cows over speaking to anyone. They had only exchanged short conversations before, but lately, the older man had begun stopping by more often. "You heading to the meeting today?" The neighbor asked. He nodded. "Yeah, they'll be expecting me." The neighbor stepped inside, rubbing his hands together. "You know, folks are talking. They say the HOA board is nervous. Real nervous. They heard the courts leaning your way." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Everyone knew the court was close to finalizing its decision. The deed had been verified twice now. The old survey maps matched perfectly. Even the county officials quietly admitted the HOA had built everything on the wrong property. The neighbor hesitated before speaking again. "You sure you're ready for what comes after?" He looked him straight in the eyes. "I'm ready for whatever's fair." The older man nodded slowly, his face thoughtful. "Fair, that's a good word for it. Hard to find these days." He stayed a moment longer, then stepped out, leaving him alone again. After the man left, he took the deed folder from the desk and opened it. The paper inside was old, the corners slightly worn, but the ink remained bold and clean. It had belonged to his grandfather before him. For years, that one document had been ignored, dismissed, laughed at. Now it was the center of everything. He ran his thumb across the signature at the bottom. His grandfather had always been a quiet type, a man who believed in patience, who believed that truth always rose to the surface, no matter how deeply people tried to bury it. That belief had become a kind of compass for him. And now, as the last steps approached, he could almost feel the old man's steady presence behind him. He placed the deed carefully back in the folder and stood up. It was time to get ready. The community center where the HOA held its meetings was already busy when he arrived. Cars lined the edges of the gravel lot, and groups of people stood in small clusters, whispering. Some looked curious, others worried. A few members of the HOA board stood together near the entrance, speaking rapidly among themselves. When they saw him, their conversation stopped. Their faces tightened, not angry exactly, but tense, like people walking on thin ice. He walked past them without a word and took a seat near the front, resting the deed folder on his lap. The room filled quickly. Even people who normally had nothing to do with HOA business came to watch. Something about the situation had pulled everyone in, maybe because it was the first time they had seen the HOA face a real challenge. When the meeting began, the board spoke first, trying to act confident. They read from their printed statements, listing rules, bylaws, fines, building codes, everything they always used to control people. But their voices weren't as steady as usual. They avoided looking at him. Then the county representative stood. The room went quiet. He carried a thick binder under his arm, the kind that usually meant serious business. "We've completed the review," the representative began, opening the binder. His voice was calm and even, but each word sounded heavy. "The property boundaries, original surveys, and historical deeds have all been examined. Everything matches the claims submitted by him." He looked at the man sitting in the front row. A few murmurs spread through the crowd. The representative continued. "Based on all the documents, maps, and legal records, the area where the 35 homes were constructed falls entirely on land that does not belong to the homeowners association." The room erupted, not with shouting, but with restless movement, people shifting, turning to each other, whispering in disbelief. One board member stood up quickly. "There must be some mistake. We've operated here for years, and no one said," the representative cut him off gently but firmly. "There is no mistake. The construction was done without the permission of the rightful landowner." All eyes shifted toward him. He didn't move. He didn't smile. He just sat quietly, as he had for years, holding the same folder he'd held the day the HOA first tried to claim his land. The board members looked shaken. Their faces had gone pale. Everything they had built, everything they had argued for, everything they believed they controlled, it was slipping through their fingers, right in front of everyone. The representative wasn't finished. "The final documents will be filed with the court tomorrow. Once recorded, the deed will be recognized publicly, and the property will legally return to its rightful owner." A long silence followed. It was the kind of silence that comes when people realize a truth they had tried not to see. He finally rose from his chair. The room quieted even more, if that was possible. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't talk with drama. He just spoke plainly, the way he always had. "I didn't want any trouble," he said. "I asked nicely. I asked more than once. All I wanted was respect for what's mine." He then tapped the folder lightly with his fingers. "But since nobody listened, now we all have to live with what comes next." He walked out of the room as quietly as he had entered, leaving behind a board full of stunned faces and a crowd full of people who understood maybe for the first time just how deeply the HOA had crossed the line. Outside, the sun was starting to set, filling the sky with soft orange and gold. He took a slow breath. The hard part, the waiting, the silence, the patience was almost over. Tomorrow, everything would change. What happened next wouldn't be loud or dramatic. It would simply be nature doing what it had always done when left alone. And the HOA had no idea how close that moment truly was. The next morning arrived quietly, almost too quietly for what the day was about to bring. A soft gray sky hung over the valley, and the air smelled like damp soil, carrying a faint promise of rain. The kind of morning that made people stay indoors a little longer. But for him, there was no staying inside. Today was the day everything would become final. He stood by his kitchen window, watching the faint light spread across the fields. The court filing would be completed within hours, and once the deed was officially recorded, the land would legally be his again, every inch of it, including the space where the 35 houses now stood. He didn't feel excitement. He didn't feel triumph. What he felt was something slower, quieter, a long exhale he had needed for years. He grabbed his jacket and stepped outside. The gravel crunched under his boots as he walked toward the old truck. Before getting in, he paused and glanced toward the dam. It sat there like a sleeping giant, still and silent. The water level behind it had risen steadily over the months, waiting patiently, just like he had waited. Nature didn't rush anything. It simply moved when it was timed out, and today, it was time. He drove to the county building first. People were already coming in and out, carrying folders, coffee cups, and early morning tiredness. When he walked inside, the county clerk recognized him and offered a small nod. "It's done," she said softly. "Filed at 7:43 a.m. The records are updated. It's officially yours." There was no dramatic music, no special announcement, just a simple sentence that carried years of weight. "Thank you," he replied. When he stepped outside again, a light drizzle had started. He looked up at the sky for a moment, letting a few drops hit his face. The valley always felt different when rain returned, like the land was waking up. He climbed back into his truck, turned the engine on, and drove slowly toward the outskirts of the new neighborhood the HOA had built. He wanted to see it one last time before everything shifted. The rows of homes stood neatly in place, bright paint, trimmed lawns, and new driveways. People moved around their morning routines, stepping out to pick up packages, walking dogs, waving to neighbors. Nobody there knew the court had just confirmed that none of this should have been built where it stood. Nobody knew the ground beneath them was now officially returned to him. He didn't blame them. Most of them had been misled from the beginning. They bought their homes believing everything was approved and legal. They trusted the HOA to be honest about the land. The mistake hadn't been theirs, but consequences didn't disappear just because someone didn't know. He parked at a quiet spot overlooking the dam and the entire valley. From there, he could see the neighborhood, the hills, and the long stretch of land that had always belonged to his family. The drizzle softened the scenery, making everything look distant, almost delicate. He got out of the truck and walked toward the dam's control shack. The key felt warm from being inside his pocket. He held it loosely for a moment, remembering when his grandfather had handed it to him years ago. "This land listens to patience," the old man had said, "and patience listens to time." Now he finally understood what those words meant. He unlocked the small metal door and stepped inside. The air smelled of old machinery and damp concrete. He moved quietly, not rushing, touching the familiar levers and switches with steady hands. The system had been maintained regularly. He always made sure of that. Even when the HOA ignored his rights, he never ignored his responsibilities. He rested his hand on the main lever. Outside, the rain began to fall harder, tapping gently against the metal roof. The sound filled the small shack, calm and rhythmic. He didn't pull the lever right away. Instead, he stood there thinking about everything that had happened, how the HOA dismissed him, how they built without permission, how he stayed quiet for so long. The waiting had been the hardest part. Watching them take what wasn't theirs, hoping they would listen, hoping they would realize the mistake before it was too late. But they never did. And now nature was going to reclaim what belonged to it long before any HOA existed. He finally pushed the lever down. There was no explosion, no burst of chaos, nothing dramatic. Instead, the gate began to shift slowly, creaking from years of resistance. Water rushed forward with a deep, steady roar, not wild, not destructive, just powerful in the way only nature can be. It poured through the opening, moving down toward the valley in a wide, controlled flow. The ground had been dry for so long that the returning water spread quickly, filling old channels, slipping around rocks, sliding into places where streams used to run. The valley didn't panic. It welcomed the water back like an old friend. He stepped outside and watched as the flow grew stronger. The drizzle had turned into a gentle rain now, adding to the rising movement across the land. He could see the edges of the neighborhood far away, people stepping out onto porches, pointing toward the returning water, unsure at first that it wasn't flooding. He had no intention of harming anyone or damaging anything. The release was controlled, slow, steady, natural. But the water would eventually reach the land the HOA built on. And once it did, it would show everyone the truth the HOA had ignored from the beginning. The valley was not meant to be covered with concrete. It was meant to breathe. He knew the county would step in. They would have to. When water returned to its natural path, regulations changed. People would need to be moved. Houses would need to be reassessed. The HOA would have to answer for building where they had no right to build. But all of that would happen without him lifting another finger. He walked back to his truck, soaked from the rain but calm. The water continued to move gently, finding its way through the valley like memories coming home. As he drove back toward his house, he passed a few residents standing outside with umbrellas, staring at the growing streams. Their faces weren't afraid, just confused, curious. Some even looked relieved, as if they sensed something natural was happening, something the valley had been waiting for. He didn't stop to explain. He didn't need to. The county would handle everything now. His part was done. When he reached his home, he stepped onto the porch and sat down in the old wooden chair. The sound of distant water filled the air, soft and steady, blending with the rain. For the first time in years, the valley felt right again, not because he wanted revenge, not because he wanted anyone to suffer, but because the land had finally been allowed to return to the way it was meant to be. He leaned back, letting the cool air wash over him. The dam was open, the deed was filed, and the long fight was over. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply breathed deep, slow, and peaceful. The valley would heal now, and so would he.